Hello and welcome to the 5th edition of our Guest Talks webinar series. We'd like to thank everyone for logging on and listening. First of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to our sponsor, Cisco. They help schools, colleges and universities quickly scale to virtual learning with a high level of security. Cisco WebEx empowers you to connect the campus by providing a reliable and robust experience that bridges the physical and virtual campus. I'll just post a pop-up for you now so you can click on the link to find out more. Okay. In addition to handouts, in the handout section, there's a brochure and video that you can download to find out more information about Cisco's education solutions. A few bits of information before the webinar, before we get underway. For all attendees, you can find a control panel on the side. There's a Q&A tab, a polls tab, and a handouts tab where you can find further information from our panelists. During the webinar, feel free to use the Q&A, ask us questions. The panelists would really love to hear your thoughts. We'll do our best to get through them. If we don't manage to get through them all, the system saves them down and we'll get back to you after the event. If you want to enjoy the webinar all over again, you can do so as we'll be uploading it to our YouTube channel and sending it out to all attendees by email. We'll be on social media as well during the webinar. So if you want to chat to us there, follow us on Twitter @GESS Education and use the hashtags #GuestBuy and #GuestTalks. The eagle-eyed amongst you probably noticed that Steve Banbury isn't with us today. Unfortunately, Steve isn't well, so he wasn't able to take part today. We'd like to wish him a speedy recovery from everyone on the GESS team and hope he feels better soon. We would also like to say a massive thanks to Mark Anderson, ICT evangelist, for stepping in at the last minute to be our chair and moderator. It really is much appreciated. And now I'd like to introduce you to the rest of our fantastic panel. Dr. Neil Hopkins, Executive Principal of Sunmark School, Dubai. Jenny Burke, Deputy Head Teacher and Digital Strategy Lead at GESS Dubai. Ben Rothwell, Assistant Head Teacher, Curriculum and Innovation at Victory Heights Primary School, Dubai, and Dima Kandalat, Director of Country Digital Acceleration Programme at Cisco Middle East and Africa. Thank you, and over to you, Mark.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for joining us for this webinar this afternoon. Apologies there for the frog in my throat. So we are going to explore the way in which we can maximise the impact of hybrid learning based upon the experience of these really knowledgeable and experienced guests today. Just before we get started, just so we can do a little shout out for each of ourselves as well. Nice introduction there from Sarah, but can I ask you all to, just moving along from the top to the bottom, just introduce yourself and share a little bit about what it is that you do, please.
Hi, I'm Jenny Burke, and I'm a deputy at GESS Dubai in the secondary school. I also lead the digital strategy across our 3 schools. I've been working here at GESS for 11 years, previously as a geography teacher, and now on the leadership team leading CPD and teaching and learning.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jenny. Ben.
Hi there, I'm Ben Hoffwell. I'm at Victory Heights Primary School. I've been in Dubai for 8 years and my role at Victory Heights has developed over that time, but I'm currently an assistant head teacher and I lead on innovation and the curriculum. But specifically with regards to our digital strategy, I've been involved in our rise to be a Google reference school. We are one-to-one Chromebooks in year 2 through to 6. We are very integrated in Google Suite.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And congratulations again on your recent marriage, Ben. Thank you for taking some time out not long after that happened. Congratulations.
Thanks.
And Dr. Neil, if you could share a bit about yourself, please.
Yeah, so I'm Neil Hopkins. I'm Executive Principal for Fortis Education. I'm Principal at Sunmark School as well here in Dubai. I've been a school leader for 25 years. I know it's hard to believe when you look at my incredible youth, but over that time I've been involved in advising UK government, Secretaries of State, as well as rolling around on the floor in early years classrooms, wrestling with emergent technology from about 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was checking out your LinkedIn profile before, and I was seeing an ICT and education presentation from at least 15, 20 years ago there with some really forward-thinking things. So I'm really excited to hear your perspectives in the webinar today as well, Dr. Neil. Thank you for joining us. And finally, Dima.
Hi, my name is Dima Kantat. I work for Cisco. I'm the director of Country Digital Acceleration Program based here in Dubai, covering Middle East and Africa. I've been in the region for almost 22 years, working in technology and digital transformation for public sector and government clients. I've recently went back to the education seats, and I'm doing now masters in digital education. So looking forward for today's conversation.
Well, hopefully you can use today's webinar as part of your points towards that qualification, perhaps. Maybe not. Thank you very much for joining us, Dima. So the past 8 or 9 months have been really, really tough. I noted a tweet from Philippa Raithmel, who is head of digital at Cranley in Abu Dhabi, just last night, talking about how it feels like schools in the Middle East are starting to get into their rhythm with this sort of a thing. Starting with you, Jenny, what has worked well for you at GESS, and what pitfalls have you encountered thus far?
Well, we've learned a lot along the way, that's for sure, through distance learning and then through this new way of working in term 1 this year. I guess what we've learned the most is that by sticking with our day-to-day structure, it's really given us familiarity in what we're doing to therefore be able to create the same online spaces. We've stuck really quite rigidly to our digital governance, our digital strategy, and that's really helped us to be able to achieve what we have achieved. I'm not sure it's necessarily pitfalls, but it's been challenging. You know, it's not been easy for everybody. But we're getting there, and I think we're really pleased with our progress. I guess the hardest challenge recently has been around the practical subjects, which I'm sure all schools are finding, DT and science and sport, but we're putting that provision in place for our students.
That's really interesting. You mentioned there those challenges for the practical subjects. Have you got any sort of experiences that would actually be useful for viewers to sort of transfer into their practice in their schools at all, Jenny, relating to those 3 subject areas you mentioned?
So in DT and science lessons, our teachers are using webcams on kind of tripod stands, the flexible arm, the visualizers, so that the students who are working in the virtual learning classrooms or the students who are working at home can also access the experiments. Or the DT practicals. And we're also working on a kind of rota basis, so that when the students are in the class with the DT teachers, as an example, they have that time for practical with the teacher, and then they do the theory work when they're in their virtual learning room.
That's cool. So I was talking to Clive Gibson, head of chemistry at your school, just yesterday about their approaches there, and it seems like things are really, really working. So congratulations on that. Over to you for a second, Ben. Same question, really. How are you finding things at Victory Heights?
Yeah, similar experience to Jenny. It was kind of like being dropped out of a plane and not knowing where your parachute was way back in March, and scrabbling around and sort of just pulling the cord before we hit the ground. So it was totally new to us all, and I'm sure we all got the same shared experience with that. It's been really tough for us, I think, in balancing expectations of the students, the parents, and the staff, and not necessarily expectations, but the sort of things like workload and things like that. So we have parents who are expecting children who are working remotely to be fully involved all the time, but staff who are telling us that that's just not feasible or possible, and our own sort of research around that saying that actually, even though the parents are asking for us, that's just something that in primary especially we're finding challenging to provide. So it's trying to balance those sort of communications with all of those different stakeholders. And I think as well, the biggest thing that we've had to change about what we perhaps do in a normal environment is just to be like really agile to the challenges that we face, and be prepared to put our hands up and say, look, we got that wrong, we're changing, and we'll change 1 or 2 days after we make a policy decision. because there's no point in us just persevering down this long road towards an obvious failure that's going to happen. And we haven't made too many of those mistakes, but they do happen, and it's natural. And in school, in the normal environment, you can work and develop those strategies, but we just, in this sort of environment, in these new ways, we haven't had the possibility to do that. So we have had to be very agile to the challenges that we face. And I think parents have appreciated that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Ben. Thank you. You mentioned agility. Can you give me an example of a situation with what's been happening over the last sort of 8-9 months, about where you've had to be agile and what you've done in response to that?
I think just day to day on an operational basis. For example, with the regulations in the UAE, where children are allowed to be distance learners or in school learners, and initially we felt that maybe that if they were going to commit to that sort of that path, that they would need to do it for an extended period of time, that we didn't want children on an in and out basis. But then parents started to say that they were having concerns about the child's safety, but it was only on a short-term basis. And then we have to sort of reevaluate that. And it's difficult to do an about face. It does, in terms of the optics of it, it looks like you are sort of just reversing the bus, but we have to treat all of these cases on merit and actually go, yeah, we did get that wrong, because we do recognize that actually, if, for example, there's a case emerges within the school, that parents are obviously going to find it very difficult and very challenging, and it being threatening for their children to come in and want to remove their children on a short-term basis. Whereas we thought originally that we would want them to do that for 6 to 8 weeks as a minimum. And so that's just an operational change that we had to make.
That's really interesting how you've got to sort of be reactive, like you say, and be agile so you can be responsive to those sorts of things. Bringing to yourself, Dr. Neil, and how are your experiences sort of marrying up in what you're hearing from Jenny and Ben so far? How does that sort of relate to the experiences that you've had?
Yeah, I think it resonates completely with what we've had. What I would add to it is the interesting dimension of not knowing how long this will last and the impact that that's had. So, as Ben was saying, as we jump out the plane with no parachute, if you discovered that the ground was only 2 meters underneath you, it would be quite a different survival strategy to discovering that the ground is 5 kilometers underneath you. And I dare say, if there were 5 kilometers, there would be a period in which you said to yourself, you know what, this isn't so bad actually, and we're sort of we're coasting along. But of course, as you get further into that 5 kilometer drop, you realize that when you hit the ground, it's going to go with a bit of a thump. And I think the reality is that we've all faced that longitudinal nature of this virus is such that we didn't know when we went into lockdown 6 months ago. We didn't know whether that was going to last for 6 weeks or 3 months or 9 months or 2 years, and we still don't. We still don't know that. And I think one of the things that is very much growing as a concern in my mind is the impact that the longitudinal nature of this very different form of learning sort of brings about in the children's mind. It's interesting, isn't it? Back in the past, I've had some involvement in school design, and what would happen is that when companies or governments investing in school design, they say, okay, what kind of learning do you want to take place? And let's make sure that the environment fits that. Whereas actually what happens with COVID is that around the world, governments tend to have legislated for what the environment would look like. And now the learning has to fit into that environment. It's a complete upside down shift in the way that we would learn. And I think the notion of technology, or even just children's experience returning to school, if schools will reopen, turn that all on its head. It's a very alien environment where we're having to fit into a new space, rather than a new space being ergonomically designed to fit around us. And so I think the implications became more significant in our mind, that we were really going to have to start to think about how our pedagogy should change in order to facilitate great learning in this enforced new environment, rather than how might we change our learning experiences, how might we change our lessons, how might we change our classrooms in order to fit the kind of learning we still facilitate. It's been a fascinating journey.
No, absolutely, and it's interesting you mentioned sort of the physical and the digital. Moving on to yourself for a second, Dima, could you share possibly how, in your experience, how we can sort of bridge that sort of divide between the physical and the digital?
Yeah, and the challenges that the panelists were describing is actually common. We've seen this across the world, not also here in the region. I have to say that, you know, looking at the schools here, they came a long way in such a short period of time. As you said, with many uncertainties and many unpreparedness to how do we adopt technology to help us really take that challenge forward. So basically, there's a lot of elements when you discuss digital education and really making sure we have all the components that we need to build for the future. So now we might have an opportunity to really learn from our experience and the challenges that we face and say how we take a few steps forward to allow us to drive. Maybe hybrid education will stay for a longer period of time nowadays, and the expectation that we need to go. So for me, in terms of what do we need to have to bridge that physical versus digital, is really what most of our customers, we hear them say in terms of what is the need statement that is coming out over the past 6 months with educational customers, is really how do you help me, or how technology can help me build uninterrupted, secure, and seamless learning environment end-to-end for all my education stakeholders, whether it's the teacher, the students, even the parents are now involved in the digital education, being even in the hybrid form. So really looking at this end-to-end experience and engagement model that I need to have in my physical classroom and be able to, with the use of technology, transform it into digital classroom. So it becomes a really seamless transformation between that experience. We've seen now our children at the beginning really scared to go back to school because of the COVID situation, but because of the better experience that they're having at school, they're not really opting for the digital, or now we've seen it change. But then we might be forced or put in another situation, whether it's COVID or any other pandemic or health situation. So we really need to optimize our digital capabilities within the physical classroom by introducing better accessibility devices, by having better connectivity that is allowing me to help my teachers and my students access this technology better, by creating additional advanced technology like AI and immersive technology to enhance the whole learning experience, to make it really achieve that seamless objective between physical and digital. Not many around the world also, and not here, are able to achieve this as of yet. But I think this is the challenge that COVID gave us is really an opportunity to reimagine how we design our future classroom and how we include digital capability within the physical spaces to allow us to have that seamless transition between physical and digital.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you very much, Dima. It's clear, and apologies if you can hear the bit of crackling on the line, viewers. Hopefully we can get that sorted in a moment. But it's really clear from what you're saying there to me, Dima, about how important it is to sort of think about accessibility to devices, like you mentioned, and access to tools that support that digital and physical classroom. Moving back to you, Jenny, a question for you, please, about the sort of tools and solutions you've been using as part of your strategy and framework with GESS in order to ensure continuity of learning and supporting your teachers with their work. Can you share, please, for our audience, what digital solutions you've been using to help facilitate effective hybrid learning at GESS? Is that okay?
Yes, that's Mark. So at GESS, we use Office 365 as our main platform, obviously teaching and learning and our day-to-day working across the whole school, and we integrate that with ISAMs. But I talked about digital governance before, and I don't think it matters whether it's ISAMs or SIMs or Apple Classroom or Google Classroom or Microsoft. I don't think that matters. It's how everything knits together that's so important. And I think our strong digital governance policy has underpinned all of the work that we've done. So within our digital governance policy, we have, some people would say, fairly strict rules, but I think those rules have allowed us to achieve what we have achieved. They are rules, but they're flexible and they're adaptable. So of course, we make exceptions to them, but everything across all of the 3 schools comes to the digital strategy group. On the digital strategy group, our representatives, our IT director, the 3 deputies leading the strategy in the 3 schools, the network manager, and we've met during term 3 distance learning 3 hours every Sunday to review everything that was going on across all 3 schools. We probably met lots during the week as well, just to make sure everything was tight. So as an example, everything in ISAMs creates everything on Microsoft Teams for us. So it's all automated. So we have a virtual space, and we did have a virtual space in February for every aspect of our school. So that allowed us to move quite seamlessly to a kind of a virtual infrastructure. And I think for me, that's what brought the success. And then as we've come into term 1 here now back at school, and we've moved to parents' evenings, we've been able to just add it to the existing infrastructure that we've got. The extracurricular clubs are all a virtual space, our enrichment activities, student leadership programs, our virtual admissions tours, parents making appointments with the admissions team, everything is replicated within our infrastructure. And for me, that has kept everything quite neat and tidy and allowed us to be successful.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Jenny. Just going on to those points there, I think you tightened up on and things that have worked and things that have been successful. Have you got any, let's say, for example, let's say COVID miraculously just disappears overnight tomorrow. We all wish it would, but let's say for argument's sake that it does. Given what you've been sharing so far, are there some things, you weren't doing all of these things online before, were you, in a virtual sense? Are there things that have you discussed with your colleagues about things you might sort of still continue to do if and when things do go back to normal, based on how successful they've been during the time you've been working like this?
If you look at parents' evenings as an example, our parents' evenings are held now as Teams meetings remotely. I don't think that they should always be like that in the future. I see huge value in the face-to-face meetings, but I see similar to all schools, you're probably sat in a big sports hall or a hall, and parents come along in secondary school every 5 minutes. But I think some of those meetings you'll be sat there with somebody face-to-face, and then the next 5 minutes actually might be on a Teams meeting because somebody might be at the office, or you might have somebody in front of you, as well as mum in front of you, dad at the office, those kind of scenarios. So we had some lovely examples of parents joining from one parent at Arabian Ranches, one parent in Los Angeles, both able to come to the parent conference. And I think that's really powerful in terms of the connection, between school and students and parents. One example, the flexibility of students being able to work from anywhere at any time. It's incredible, and the work that they're now engaging in with each other beyond the school day is something that will continue.
No, that's a great example, and it's something I've been hearing reporting back from lots of schools as well, particularly around the flexibility for parents, because obviously it's so important to have that triangulation of that wrapper of care, I guess, between those main stakeholders in young people's lives, the parents and the school and the teachers. Being able to bring all those things together so that you're able to have those conversations is so important. So it's great to see you've had a real success with that at GESS. Thank you.
Back to what you said about the digital solutions, because we've been using Teams throughout the whole process, there was no training to be able to just add on Parents' Evening. And so the familiarity with the platforms and the digital solutions then keeps allowing us to build and build.
So I'm assuming then, Jenny, you use Microsoft Bookings to facilitate that with parents?
Yes, we do.
Absolutely brilliant stuff. Thank you very much for sharing. It's really interesting, Ben, because you're heavily invested in Google Suite and Chromebooks, which is a different sort of setup to what they've got at GESS with Office 365. That said, have you got similar experiences to what Jenny's sharing there with how you've been doing things at Victory Heights?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, platforms is sort of a side thought. I think there's often some people get very sort of tribal almost about we're Microsoft, we're Google, we're Apple, and I don't think really it matters what route you go down. They each have their own benefits and drawbacks. I think it's that you've got a consistent approach, and I also don't necessarily think that you need to be like, right, so we're a Google school, but for our video conferencing at the moment we're using Zoom just because that for us at the time worked better. There were certain features that were preferential for us. So we although we are heavily invested in the Google infrastructure, that's not to say that we don't pull things from elsewhere. So for example, we use Slack as our internal messaging tool, and we moved to that because that for us was the best thing for the job at that moment in time. And I think that's something I think schools can get too sort of torn up in deciding sort of what platform they're going in, and they fully commit to it and they don't leave themselves open to sort of any other considerations with that. So I think as well for us, the thing that most developed in terms of the technology platform for us was that we were a Seesaw school. We used Seesaw primarily in the foundation stage for a digital portfolio platform. With the emergence of the lockdown and moving to distance learning, Seesaw became way more integral into what we were doing. And in primary setting, Seesaw is a fantastic tool. And I think I was only reading yesterday about the sort of how Seesaw sort of suddenly grew overnight, and they were saying that they were having conversations with school districts in the States that would last for a couple of months about like, we want to sign you up. And then they found that with the lockdown that the school districts are phoning up and saying, we want to be set up tomorrow, and the emergence and growth of that company. And I have to be honest, I was a bit naive as to what Seesaw was in terms of its organization, but I found out that it's sort of heavily backed by venture capitalists, and it's an ex-Google engineered product. So I think I was a bit naive. I thought it was like a homegrown industry, but it's definitely not that. But for us, Seesaw has been the most important tool in our toolkit, and so that's not Google per se, but that's really has helped us. That's really made the difference. Without that, I think we would have been in that parachute situation and we would have pulled the first cord and nothing would have happened.
Now, it's interesting you talk about that stuff there, Ben. It relates to that sort of banana principle, doesn't it? It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. And it's really lovely from my perspective, sort of listening to you, because I see that tribal thing, like you mentioned, with schools being like, well, I'm a Google school or I'm an Apple school. And clearly what works best is contextual, is what works best for you in your school with your teachers' confidence and all those sorts of things. Jumping on to yourself for a second, Dr. Neil, are there any particular digital solutions that have been sort of really, you know, we've heard about the importance of Teams and 365 at GESS. We've heard about how Seesaw's been so integral at Victory Heights. How about for yourself in your school?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would very much echo what you've just said there, Mark, that it is very contextual. And I think our approach here at Fortis Education is very eclectic. You know, we're hungry to see whether we can find a sort of a palimpsest of things that we can bring together that will create something which is, you know, is quite remarkable. And I think we did stumble across a few things in that regard, mostly motivated by difficulties that we were having. So there were some aspects of Teams that, or you know, some of the Microsoft products that we felt perhaps lost the opportunity to engage students in the way we wanted. I think engagement is key, isn't it? When you suddenly lost that face-to-face contact that Jenny was talking about in the Parents' Evening when you suddenly lost that, you really feel the weight of that in a classroom. That but perhaps you haven't realized how important the proximity is and that connection that we have by being in the same space. And so however good a platform is, I think, unless it's been designed with that, trying to somehow emulate that connection, that engagement, then inevitably it's going to fall short. And we found that a little bit with Teams, that it was easier for students to disengage or to stay under the radar than we necessarily wanted. And so we were looking for other platforms or other software packages that would help us with that. And I think in that sense, we found that Nearpod was very useful for us. There were just a whole range of aspects of it that were designed for better engagement, whether it's just simple polling or sharing of YouTube clips, et cetera, very easily within it, much more interactively, and providing that feedback for students. It was perhaps a little bit more on the front foot than some of the other usual things that people might have used. But I think not all of the things that we introduced were to do with problems that we faced. There were things that we discovered that here was an opportunity to develop our thinking, and one of them was certainly AI. So CenturyTech, has a brilliant AI engine that really enables schools to and students to have an experience that lends itself very well to online learning environments, where you're able to engage with course content and set a test, and then have supplementary interventions that AI is doing the hard work on. And I think we all want to make money while we're asleep, don't we? And I suppose if we to make that analogy, the reality is that we really want students to be learning, even if actually we're not teaching them at that current moment. And I think if the cloud is COVID, the silver lining is that perhaps it's for some of us dinosaurs like me to start to look at some of the other aspects that this new strange world that we find ourselves in demand of us. And AI is something that I really hadn't engaged with before. And I think it helped to certainly move my thinking and the thinking of some of my colleagues to embrace that sort of a platform.
No, absolutely. And out of adversity comes opportunity, doesn't it? And it gives you that chance to sort of develop things and move them forward. It's great to hear you mentioning Century, a product that I know has had a big impact in schools across the Middle East and beyond. Certainly, I was talking to some school leaders here in the UK recently about how helpful and impactful it's been. Just jumping on to you for a second, Dima, have you come across any particular tools or platforms that have been particularly useful in education during the past sort of 7 or 8 months in supporting hybrid learning?
Thank you for your question. I don't know, I just want to ask you, I switched on to headset because they told me there's a noise. Is this better now?
This is considerably better. Brilliant stuff. Thank you very much, Dina.
Thank you. Sorry for the pilot look.
That's okay.
Definitely there is many technology and tools out there, and I think, as Ben mentioned and all the other panelists, it becomes a design question really, and a functionality, what sort of requirement or experience that we want to have and we want to implement in our educational institute to help improve and engage our students better in the learning process. The technology is an enabler, not a aim as such. So for us, if we know exactly what is our requirement, what is the reimagined learning experience, end-to-end learning and teaching experience that we want to build in our school, technology becomes an easier answer. Looking at that is definitely from our perspective at Cisco, we are really focused, learning as well as everybody is learning from, the experience of having work from home and studying from home and doing everything from home. For business people, it was easy. It was just your laptop and switch it on. When you talk about learning and education, it's a whole different ballgame. So it's really focusing from our capabilities point of view, is really focusing on collaboration with innovation. So it's not just about having video conferencing capability and, talking to each other virtually is really integrating that. Again, I would like to mention the virtual and the physical spaces, and allowing students to actually use collaboration in an innovative way to collaborate and co-create within the classroom environment and outside the classroom environment. So it's not just the digital education or online learning, it's actually within the classroom. How do I use those tools to innovate? And as Dr. Neil said, artificial intelligence is very important, and we're looking at AI capability infused in some of the solutions and the collaboration platforms like teacher bots or teacher assistant bot that will help us, in probably in asynchronous and even in synchronous. How do we actually imitate a breakout session within a live session? So we are now in a live session. We can probably choose 2 people to go and work together without having to interrupt the call, to work together and work on something assignment during the classrooms, during the virtual setup, and come back. It's all about that aspect of collaboration and co-creation. And I see future in terms of how we bring gamification capabilities into that environment, and immersive technology within the physical classroom. So now we're talking about technology within the actual classroom. So these are the areas that we are focusing on in developing on top of our existing platform to help really enhance and improve the learning and teaching experience in the physical classroom, not only in the digital platform.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Dima. That sort of ties in nicely. And I'm going to work backwards this time, Dr. Neil, to give you a chance to go first. You don't feel like you're always the person sort of struggling for an answer at the end. But it all does tie in quite nicely. You mentioned artificial intelligence there, Dima. You've been talking about, as well, Dima, about the technology sort of not dictating the learning. And that reminds me of a quote from an old colleague of mine, Zoe Elder, who wrote the book Full On Learning. And when we did our deployment many years ago with iPad 1-to-1, she was really clear as a leadership strategy that the technology should enhance but not dictate the learning. But you've alluded to it a bit, Dr. Neil, in your response about using Sentry and AI. One of the benefits of using AI is to reduce teacher workload a bit, particularly around those sort of repetitive tasks around marking and assessment. So just could you share how you've been approaching assessments the past sort of 8 or 9 months, and any sort of things you've learned about that, any ways in which you've made or streamlined those things to make them a bit easier in schools at all? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think it's difficult, if I'm honest. I think not only is it difficult, it's also very important. So when we're suffering this disconnection away from our students, we discover that a lot of what we use to assess how they're doing is not just about the way that they bark at the prints. It's to do with how they're approaching things, what their struggles are, their general demeanor when they're approaching tasks. And so I think it becomes a tricky area, and that's why I think AI is so important, because as I was saying earlier, there's a tendency in an online environment to try and mimic what you do in a physical world. So if we imagine that our assessment process is handing out a bunch of tests, the students completing those tests, handing them back in as marking them, that's one scenario of making an assessment. Is that necessarily going to work in an online environment? Well, without being cynical, if you hand a test out and the children do surprisingly well at it, sometimes you can just wonder whether maybe, are they sitting that test in the same conditions they would if they were in school? And I think that's a problem. It's the whole notion of parental support, we all know has been a terrific issue for us in schools, because we're so reliant on the parents to support their children, especially their younger children. As Ben was saying, down in the early years, boy, is that difficult. Really difficult for everybody. I have 3 children. I know exactly how difficult it is to be coping with an online environment. Sometimes I'm glad just to shut the door and say, "No, I'm working. Leave me alone." So I think that, the whole assessment process is something that we need to approach very carefully. So We've tried as far as possible to employ a range of strategies to do that. But I think, the most important thing, Mark, is actually the attitude towards the assessment. And it's trying to get our students to feel part of the investigation rather than a judgment. Because we're all sort of leaping into the dark here, aren't we? We don't know what the impact is going to be of this extended period. And so I think what we need to do is to really recruit the students as part of this testing process, rather than as perhaps still using the old thinking, which says, we're going to give you this stuff, you need to figure out what the answers are, and we'll see where you are. We really want something, I think, genuine formative assessment. And it's interesting when you think about the conversations we've had about assessments over the years. The reality, we have assessment of learning. That's the old test. Here's a test, we're going to assess what you've learned. Then we have, the cool and trendy assessment for learning, which is really about teachers using what they're gaining as information to then perhaps change the direction of lessons and give students different experiences. It's more formative. But I think what this has shown us is that actually we ought to move to a third position, which is assessment as learning. So actually the process of the assessment itself is crucial. And in this particular scenario, it's the students being able to sort of zoom out and be a third party kind of figure, so that what they can do is they can say, look, this is how I'm performing in this test. And this is interesting. This is telling me that I don't really know this stuff that I thought I knew. And then to ask that other metacognitive question, which is, why don't I know that? And why do I think that I did know that? And I think that assessment as learning, third step, which really hasn't been talked about very much in the last 10 or 20 years, is really thrown into sharp relief by this particular process. And I think AI is a great way of supporting that, because what the AI engine is able to do is to cluster together the kind of problems you're having, and then to offer some extra input solutions for the student, not only to get better at that particular skill, but then to start to recognize for themselves, that's why I'm struggling with that thing. Hey, maybe this is repeating itself in other subjects. So we've tried to work towards that, towards an assessment as learning process where the student is involved in the formative assessment, rather than it just being the teacher involved in that formative assessment.
That's really, really interesting to hear that conversation from you there, Dr. Neil. It resonates with some conversations I've had with a colleague of Jenny's recently, and a session I remember vividly from when I was at the GESS Digital Summit a few years ago. And also, Ben, from your work as part of within the UAE Research Schools Network as well, thinking about metacognition and that importance. And Trish Coffey from GESS spoke recently about the importance of like a whole school revision strategy, not just doing in isolation. Ben, jumping to you for a second on that topic. Can you sort of share, assessment as learning, involving students in those learning conversations, and we all know, like Dylan Willem has shared many times, as soon as a student gets their result from a test, they disengage with the learning process, don't they? So, Ben, can you share a little bit about how you're sort of taking all these things on board at Victory Heights? And then Jenny, coming back to you next, sort of to round around that sort of topic around metacognition and retrieval practice and revision and all those sort of things, please. So Ben first, please.
Yeah, so as Neil said, we still are scrambling around in the dark for the answers. Oh, he disappeared. Hi again, Neil.
I was scrambling around in the dark. I'm sorry about that, but I decided to put the light on to make the metaphor come alive. I'm in the dark.
But no, I think generally speaking, as educators, we're scrabbling in the dark for answers to the assessment dilemma. It is difficult, and as Neil mentioned, so often during the distance learning, the 100% distance learning process, we were seeing outcomes from certain children that didn't match our expectations. And whether that's a bias that we have against certain children, that maybe in the classroom we're biased against their performance, where maybe we think too highly of them or too lowly of them, or whether it is, as Neil suggests, and I'm hesitant to say this, but parents are perhaps giving too much support to some of their children. And it's very difficult as educators for us to be able to assess that, and parents certainly wouldn't be willing to answer that question, I wouldn't imagine. And for us as a primary school that's feeding into some schools that will be looking heavily on student outcomes for whether they'll be allowed into secondary schools, then that does become a major concern. Children in the UAE, their parents do want them to get into the best schools, and some of the best schools do demand really high outcomes for them. And so this opportunity at the end of last year perhaps would have represented a good opportunity for their results to be higher than perhaps they would have been if they were in class. That's just me, just imagining a scenario. Hopefully that didn't happen. In terms of what we do in terms of now, and when we have the vast majority of our children in school, but we are limited in terms of, for example, our physical contact. So we're not being able to take books in to mark them. So we're having to develop strategies. How can we get around that? And we are reverting to some tried and tested strategies. Whiteboards are becoming ever increasingly important. And as you said earlier on, Mark, about the digitalness. I love digital, but actually there's some good old fashioned teaching techniques that this has really brought back to the forefront. But then in the same light, we do use things like quizzes and Kahoot and things like that, which are great strategies for assessing children's knowledge in the here and now. I think one of the things that we found is that, especially during the distance learning when the children are at home, is we structure our day around long lessons of an hour, 40 minutes to an hour. And we do that primarily when we're in school because it suits the rooming and it suits the movement of children around schools. Whereas actually, probably as adults, we would prefer to learn in smaller chunks. I know that if I'm trying to learn on like a blended course, or I'm going on to Coursera or edX, I don't want to spend necessarily an hour learning something. I could probably spend 20 minutes more productively. And so I think it's becoming ever increasingly important when we design learning in the future, and it will continue to move on, is that are we constraining our learning to the environment that we're in? And I think Neil touched upon it earlier on. We sort of build everything based on our environment and our timings and things like that. This is a good opportunity for us to look, does the curriculum necessarily have to be delivered in hour chunks? And I don't think that's the way that education will go. I certainly don't think for 1 minute that a whole distance, a blended hybrid approach is necessarily the right way forward. But I think face to face, we can still learn those lessons. But that is going to be incredibly challenging for school leaders, because we do certain things for certain very good reasons. We don't want children moving from class to class every 20 minutes. So it's that balance.
Absolutely. I say balance is really important. You mentioned the context word earlier as well. And again, what might work in your school might not work in Arabian Ranches, and backwards and forwards. It is really, really difficult, but so important to try and take on board the best thinking and then reflect that back in the things you come up with in your schools. Moving on to you again, Jenny. We were talking before about whole school revision and assessment processes. What's your take on this?
I think it's really interesting what Neil was saying as well as what Ben was saying. You know, having a range of opportunities for the students is so important. And Neil talked earlier about how pedagogy has had to change, but Ben's talking about how remembering the things that we've always done and embedding those things well is also important. And yeah, the formative assessment, the low stakes, regular testing, regular checking for understanding, really effective cold calling came into its own. In the live lessons. You learn quite quickly. If you didn't talk to a student by name, everybody in the lesson answered. I was hoping that would mean that I was walking around and never ever saw a hand up in the school again. We're not quite there yet. But yeah, pedagogy has had to change, and we've learned a lot along the way. But I think the things that we've always done are also important. We talked about retrieval practice, having a whole school approach. That's something that we're embedding at GESS, and we're working hard to have a common language of assessment across the school. But Neil also talked about students understanding how they've learned and metacognition, and we've actually been doing a lot of work on that too over the last year, and embedding reflection into our curriculum, and also reporting on students' ability to reflect. That's part of our reporting to parents now. And I think students find that difficult. And I think if we can crack that, like Neil said, we will be able to make more progress with assessments, because students reflecting on their misconceptions or their mistakes and how they're learning will have a bigger impact across all of the subjects. And so it's interesting to hear the colleagues say the same thing.
No, that is really interesting, Jenny. Thank you. It's interesting you mentioned the word reflection as well, because reflecting on your learning is so important to help you then think about your next steps, what you might need to do to improve, so forth and so on. It's interesting to say, as a school that's using Office 365, a recent addition to the Teams setup is an app called Reflect. And one of the things I love about the Reflection app inside Teams is that it not only has opportunities in there for learners to reflect either to themselves or between the student and the teacher or the student and the whole class, it also gets them to think about reflecting things around well-being. That there's a whole well-being section in there. So that leads me nicely, a little segue onto the last question I want to ask today about well-being. You can see where I'm going with this, look. So thinking about well-being, it has been really, really tough. I mean, teaching is a hard job under normal circumstances, but spinning all these plates, children, like Neil said, I feel myself when I was, homeschooling my children while still working, I was actually, like I say, it was easier to do the work than it was to actually look after my own children and do all of that. Can you share, Neil, coming to you first this time, again, just to ask you, please, how the well-being of staff and students has been prioritised in your settings?
Well, we really focus very hard on it, and we're probably globally one of the leading schools for positive education and the implications for well-being that carries with it. But even with our considerable experience, it's not easy. And as I was saying earlier, I think it's the unfolding nature of it. It's a little bit like pain, isn't it? If you know that pain is going to last a certain period, you can grit your teeth and get through it. I certainly find that in the gym. If I know that I've only got to do 2 more of those press-ups, I can just about manage them. But if I think there might be 10 beyond that, then I give up after just 1. And there's something about knowing where the end line is that makes it possible, and therefore there's something about not knowing where the end line is to this experience that makes well-being particularly important. And I think in an online environment that's very difficult. We found it just in terms of understanding whether students had turned up to lessons and how engaged they were, because that's more difficult to ascertain when you're totally online. Then of course the reality is that it becomes difficult to know whether or not you've really got somebody plugged into what you're doing. So I think the well-being is certainly crucial. Of course, interestingly, in the context of this discussion, the use of screens quickly became a problem. And we've all got that stuff on our phones, haven't we, that says you've been very naughty, you've been looking at your screen for, and then it gives you a time, and you say, I have not. I never looked at it that much. But of course, we've all spent too much time looking at that screen. But now suddenly we're putting our students into an environment. Where actually, they're constantly looking at screens, and we're saying that this is the diet that we're giving you. And so I think well-being certainly starts in the notion of let's get them away from the screen. Well, as Ben was saying, there's a real curriculum design problem for school leaders, because we're in some sort of remote situation, if that's where we are. And yet the medium of reaching the children tends to be via technology. And yet we're saying the technology and the time you're spending on that is part of the problem. Oh my goodness. So suddenly it comes back to a whole curriculum redesign issue. And this is what Ben was referring to, I think very much to the point. What do we need to do about our lessons, and how do we need to think of them differently? How long should you be looking at a screen? And when you're not looking at a screen, what should you be doing? Is it just that you then vegetate, or are we just saying to the children, don't attend the lesson, and therefore they say, great, let me go on to Fortnite? That's all that, because that can happen, Mark. That can definitely happen. And so the reality is that I think we need to be thinking much more holistically about the whole experience that students are in. Now that we're mostly around the world returned to school, this is an opportunity for us to reconfigure your children's thinking and their minds and reskill those, so that actually there's a different approach, that if shutdowns do come again, if there are other waves, that actually we've used this time really gainfully to make sure that our students understand how to take good care of their mental health, how to take good care of their vision, their physical health. I don't know about you, but I think most people put on about 10 kilograms during lockdown. We became very static. Amazon, of course, had profits through the roof, as did most food delivery services. And so people got more stuff and ate more stuff whilst we vegetated. And we need to think about how that's going to affect our young children and the kind of values that will be instilling in them as they watch their elderly parents put on an extra 10 kilos and they think, you know, that's all right, Dad's doing it, you know, it's not doing him any harm, I'll do it too. So I think there's a very broad range, and I'm speaking clearly to myself in this particular aspect as I look at the other presenters who are all very svelte. But you know, there's a very particular range of mental health and well-being aspects that we need to consider. It's not just about screen time, it is about physicality, it is about connecting and socializing. I'm one of the most antisocial people I know, and even I miss people during lockdown. So the reality is that we need to think, how can we use our technology to connect people better?
That's a great response. And socialization is so important. I mean, there are so many things in your little bit of sharing there, Neil, that resonate with me and my own parenting. You know, my children are fortnight, and the discussions I've been having recently about sort of game addiction and it links to mental health and all these different things. I'm really sorry, Jenny and Dima and Ben. We're just 5 minutes from the end of the webinar. So can I ask you same question both to Jenny and Ben in a moment, but Dima, I wanted to ask you about the CDA work you've been doing, the country digital acceleration stuff, because that surely has been really instrumental in all these schools still being able to maintain continuity of learning, surely.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. So CDA, or Country Digital Acceleration Program, is a corporate investment program through which we partner with country leaders and government officials to help them overcome challenges with their digital transformation journeys across various sectors. And of course, education is a main pillar in most of our CDA programs in our countries. What we've seen, our focus around the world is to work on initiatives over the past 6 months in actually trying to bridge the digital divide that is actually widened with the current pandemic, from basic connectivity and access to online learning and schools in underprivileged communities and rural areas. We all know about the story that went viral about the 2 girls at the Taco Bell sitting outside to access free Wi-Fi. I think here in the region, it's not as relevant, and we take accessibility maybe or connectivity for granted, but this has been the major programs and projects that we worked across the world. Here in the region, our focus has been around improving the end-to-end digital and physical experience for educational institute, helping in some cases in rural area, especially in Saudi Arabia. We worked with the Ministry of Education to help ensure that the rural areas have access to qualified and caliber teachers that are centered in the main cities, and by building both physical and digital classrooms across the kingdom, it helped the student have access to those better teachers, if I may say, that are centered in the city, and engage with them in online learning and improve the attendance and reduce the dropout from public schools. In some of the UAE engagement we are looking with some university and educational institute is really about your earlier question, is how we merge between physical and digital, really building the classroom of the future with infused technology and capability to help address some of the needs that we're going to have in social distancing. So we will see classroom with less students. So how do we make sure that the students studying at home have the same experience, and introducing some of the AI capability in physical classrooms? So this has been our focus as CDA, and education has been heart of our investment in the past six months, for sure.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. And infrastructure is just so key, isn't it? You know, ensuring that you've got that solid bedrock upon which to build, ensure these things happen. Jumping back into that question, yeah, absolutely. Jumping into that question about well-being, Jenny, have you got some thoughts around how your infrastructure has helped to sort of support teachers with their well-being in the school?
I guess having a system that we've been using for the last 4 years and not introducing anything new, it meant that we didn't need the staff training, which obviously bought people time. Time is crucial, isn't it? As educators, we're always fighting to find time, and so we were able to strip back meetings and strip back the calendar because people didn't, or the teachers didn't need the training and the students didn't need the training, and we're able to move seamlessly forward with that. And I think that was kind of key in terms of the infrastructure and well-being.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've always been struck by how, you know, forward-thinking colleagues are at the school. From knowing you for a number of years now, so many teachers are just right at the front of their game at the school. From Trish Coffey that I mentioned earlier, to Clive Gibson, to Steve, who was supposed to be hosting this, chairing this today, to Luke, to everybody. It's such a fantastic plethora of awesome colleagues to work with. Ben, jumping back to you with the final thoughts around well-being of staff and of students. Could you sort of share, as a nice little wrapper at the end, how you've been approaching things at Victory Heights in relation to that, please?
Yeah, so in terms of staff well-being, we've always sort of prided ourselves on doing a great job in terms of teacher workload and staff well-being. And I'd have to say that right now, if you have to assess where we are in terms of teacher workload, we're not doing a good enough job at the moment. And circumstances are dictating that for us. It's certainly not through lack of trying. Teachers are facing a much more difficult run of things because of the circumstances that are around. So, for example, there's been a reduction in the amount of specialist lessons that teachers in primary will be getting, and so they are teaching for longer. I myself know, having moved into the classroom for a considerable longer period of time than I would normally do, the lessons are now, in terms of teacher delivery, they are way more focused on the teacher standing at the front and delivering content. That is having some benefits in terms of knowledge and skill acquisition, but it is I have found it incredibly tiring. Whereas previously you may have gone into a primary classroom and see some teaching and then some group work and all these different sort of activities where the children are able to get together. That definitely is very difficult for us to replicate in this environment. We've got children now sitting 1.5 meters apart from each other. Group work's very difficult to facilitate. It's very difficult to facilitate some of the activities that we would have enjoyed doing before. And so teachers are finding that they are leading the room far more than they perhaps would have done 12 months ago. So that's very difficult. Also, at the moment, the weather has been preventing children from going outside at break times because of the excessive temperature. We are now hopefully through that, which is pleasant, but also we are then limited in terms of the capacity of the site and the demands for social distancing. And so all of these challenges are really making it way more difficult for us to be able to prioritize teacher workload, and teachers are spending more time with the children, teaching in far more depth from the front. And yeah, our teachers are finding it very difficult, and I wish I had the answer to them, but we don't. We have done certain things like reduce the amount of meetings that we hold, and things like letting the teachers go home earlier than they perhaps would have done. But yeah, I'm rating ourselves a 5 out of 10 at the moment, and we want to be an 8 or 9 out of 10.
That's a really fair and honest reflection there, Ben. Thank you so much for your final comments there. What I've absolutely loved about all of the responses today, though, and thank you, Jenny and Ben, Dima and Dr. Neil, it's been not only your passion for ensuring that learning continues and doing the best by all of your stakeholders within your context, but it's also the sort of level of caring and thought behind all of those things, the grounding in things like pedagogy, infrastructure, mindfulness, well-being, all those different things coming together. thank you all so much for your considered and knowledgeable and experienced responses. Thank you to all of our viewers today as well on the webinar. We've had some great comments, and one person, for example, Sharon Tebow, is talking about assessment literacy, saying about how critical it is indeed, putting in there that we should perhaps have another webinar just focusing on how we approach assessments in these sort of circumstances. So perhaps that's something for the future. But thank you again to Jenny for joining us today. Thank you to Dr. Neil. Thank you to Ben. Thank you to Dima Kandalath. Thank you to Sarah. And thank you to you for joining us. And thank you to GESS for asking me to step in at the last minute to help out and cover Steve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. That was so great. And you can see from all the questions we've had that everyone's really enjoyed it. And we've had people from all over the globe actually tuning in. If any of the audience wants to follow anything up or speak to us, if you email us at marketing@guesseducation.com. Once I stop the webinar, there'll be a short survey. So please do fill that in. Let us know what you'd like to hear. We've noted down a couple of suggestions that we had about webinars in the future. Thank you again to our sponsor, Cisco. I'm just going to pop up the details again so you can see that information. Hopefully that should go in the chat. Okay, it should come up now. Sorry. Yes, that's done it. Sorry. And you can contact them directly. There's the email there. We did have a couple of people ask for further information, but please do email Zaina or get in contact with us and we can pass you along. Thank you, everyone. We also just wanted to say we've got our GESS Edtech Virtual Summit coming up on the 24th and 25th of November. So if you'd like to join in then, if you visit our website, guestleaders.com, you can register and find the programme. Thank you, take care, and bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.